Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Rosowski. I am the Director of Communications for the Education Trust Midwest. Thanks so much for joining us for this important panel discussion on Michigan's educational recovery. What now, what's next? We're grateful for our panelists for joining us today, whom we'll introduce shortly. Just a few housekeeping items. If you're tweeting about today's event, please use the hashtag #MIEdRecovery. We're going to put that in the chat. Throughout the discussion, please feel free also to place your questions for our guests in the QA box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. In the remaining 15 minutes, we'll open it up for your questions and get to as many as possible. We're about to get started in just a second. I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Executive Director of the Education Trust Midwest, Amber Arellano.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to be here and to welcome our guests today, and excited for so many of the diverse stakeholders, partners, leaders around the state that are joining us. We have stakeholders from the nonprofit, the civic, corporate, philanthropic, policy space, legislative space, grassroots space, civil rights space, so from across the great state of Michigan. So we're really excited to have you, and thank you for taking time out of your lunch hour to join us today. As you all know, so much has happened in the last 14 months, a time of unprecedented and finished learning across the country in Michigan's public education system, and a time of racial reckoning for our country and our world. We know that this is a critical time to act, to ensure that our children are not only catching up, but also accelerating through this educational recovery process that we're facing due to the pandemic. And that's going to be especially important for our most underserved students, including Black and Brown students, students with disabilities, English language learners, and low-income children. Our organization has been laser focused on key policy areas to ensure that vulnerable students are front and center in the policy discussions in Michigan over the last year. Things like ensuring early on that a table of stakeholders and leaders from across the state that we're calling a Michigan Equity Coalition joined us in calling for equitable distribution of emergency dollars, given the disproportionate impact and longstanding needs for vulnerable students in Michigan. We've done work on advocacy around the support of the pandemic EBT, which has been working very effectively to ensure vulnerable students don't go hungry. And to Governor Whitmer's credit, Michigan was the first country in the nation to embrace pandemic EBT and became a model for other states around the country for that. And our team has also been working with many other actors on advocating for closing the digital divide over the last year. We've also been, in recent months, we put out a poll that I think the highlights of that poll are important to inform and share some context for this discussion today. And in the poll that we released in partnership with a New York-based polling firm, we found that 91% of Black parents and parents of color indicated concern about their child falling behind academically because of the pandemic. And 83% of white parents also shared this concern. 85% of all Michigan parents polled agreed that state leaders should have a plan to address learning loss and make sure students catch up to their current grade level. So today, I'm so delighted to have leaders from here in Michigan and around the country that are working in the trenches vigorously, feverishly through the pandemic on exactly these issues that are so high stakes for kids around the country and our state right now. So I'd like to introduce our panel. First, I want to welcome Ahit Gopal Krishnan, the Chief Performance Officer at Connecticut State Department of Education. Welcome. Dr. Sarah Hayburn Morrison, the Executive Director at the Tennessee State Board of Education. Great to see you again, Sarah. As well as Alana Plaus, Policy Advisor and K-12 Education to Colorado Governor Jared Polis, and Kevin Polston, Superintendent of Godfrey Lee Public Schools and the Chair of Michigan Student Recovery Advisory Council, as well as a fellow Spartan. Go Green, Go White. Thanks for joining us. So thank you. Let's just jump right in. We've already have more than 24 questions from our audience. We had folks sending us questions in advance of today's conversation, and we're going to start with with a facilitated conversation before we move to the Q&A later in our discussion. So Sarah, I want to start with you. Given really Tennessee's pretty extraordinary growth in student learning over the last 10 to 15 years, certainly has become a really notable state in education conversations for the progress that you guys have been making in a number of metrics in terms of learning outcomes. I want to talk about what that means for Tennessee now and in this moment, with the goal of sharing the ongoing work of leading education states like yours, and also just wanting to spur additional dialogue and thought partnership across stakeholders about the issue of equity. So Sarah, in Tennessee, you've been engaged in pretty creative initiatives to ensure that that educational recovery is not only starting, but accelerating. In January, the Tennessee legislature held a special session on education. Can you please talk about what bills were passed, how they specifically address key concerns that have emerged during the pandemic, such as unfinished learning, and also supporting young learners struggling with early literacy? We have a third grade reading law in effect here in Michigan, and we've been struggling to make progress on moving that early literacy metric. And I know Tennessee's been, like many states around the country, this is a hard metric to move. And I know Tennessee has been working really hard on that for well over a decade. So would love to hear about your work on that and pandemic related issues.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amber, and everyone at EdTrust for having me. It's exciting to be here with other panelists to talk about these critical, timely issues. I appreciate, that folks are looking to Tennessee. I think like everyone else, though, we feel like the mountain is high and we've got a hill to climb. We haven't gotten our student achievement data yet from this year. And even when it comes back, there will be a lot of asterisks, in terms of what it can tell us. And so I think for a state like ours, who really has been accustomed to using data and obsessing over our student achievement data to help us know where to go and how to, retack when needed, we still feel like we're really flying blind right now. So I think I just know that our students have really suffered this last year. Our educators are tired. We're all feeling the weight of this pandemic, and hopefully coming out on the other side here as people get vaccinated. But again, there's a lot still to go in terms of the recovery efforts. So jumping right into your question, though, Amber, our General Assembly was able to come together for a special session in January at the governor's request, which doesn't feel like much of a jump start, but it really did help us, gain a couple extra months there in terms of planning for this summer in particular, because I think we all recognize that, when our data comes back, it's going to indicate some real gaps and some real need to accelerate student learning. And so we're looking to the summer as a key period to begin that acceleration effort. So there were 4 key provisions that passed during that special session. Happy to go into more detail on any of them, but just to kind of start at a high level. One was a Literacy Success Act, which you mentioned, Amber. In Tennessee, like many states, we've got roughly a third of our learners who are reading at grade level, which is unacceptable by any stretch. When you look at demographics and subgroups, it's even worse for our Black and Brown students, for our special ed students. And so we've got a lot of work to do as a state on ensuring that our teachers are prepared to teach the fundamentals of reading foundations, and to ensure that our ed prep partners are aligned, and that we've got a shared blueprint for what that looks like now that the research is so abundantly clear about what it takes to teach reading well. So there's a number of components there that start with ed prep and go into practice to ensure that we're all sort of rowing in the same direction on third grade reading in particular and early learners. The second big programmatic bill that passed was a learning loss and student acceleration bill. This was specifically geared at recovery and acceleration efforts and included a lot of state dollars. This was before we got, the second and third rounds of our ESSER funds. So we are fortunate to have a lot of money flowing into the state right now to help with this work. But the Learning Loss and Acceleration Act does a couple of key things around ensuring, summer camps are available in every district and for all charter students. I'm going to specifics there, but there are some pretty clear parameters for what needs to be offered in those summer camp opportunities. There's also what we're calling a learning loss bridge camp, and that's going to be something that the state funds in perpetuity for grades 4 through 8. And we really hope that, again, learning from this pandemic, we'll come to agree that the summer is a key period of learning, especially for students who are not at grade level. And so we want to make sure that not only in the next couple of years, but in perpetuity, we're offering those bridge camps for those middle grade learners. It also requires after-school mini camps. So if you're thinking about next school year, not only do we want to be really hitting it hard during our regular school hours, but we want to offer after-school opportunities for students, as well as what many people are looking at around high dosage tutoring. So there's a number of key provisions in that learning loss and student acceleration bill, which will offer extra stipends for teachers. So we think actually, hopefully it's a boon for teachers as well in terms of, once they regroup and take a breather, the ability to make some extra money over the summer. And then the other two pieces I'll just mention briefly. One was a hold harmless bill that'll make sure that while we are committed to student state assessments this spring, we're not going to be using that data in any way that will be punitive for teachers or for students. It's purely to help us know where we are, where we need to go. And then the last piece was around teacher compensation. So there was $43 million new dollars, roughly a 2% increase that was effective upon passing for our teachers as a way to recognize the just incredibly challenging year that they've had, the remarkable work that they have done and are doing. And so that was important as well as we think about the work ahead. I'll stop there though.
Yeah, I thought that I'm glad that you're raising the teacher compensation piece. I thought read about the special session in January that there was a separate budget bill that allocated funding to provide 4% raises for all Tennessee educators. Wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. Was there bipartisan support for that? And why was a pay increase important now at this time?
Yes, it did pass with bipartisan support. I think that was one thing we could all definitely agree needed to happen. And thankfully, our budget numbers as a state came back better than expected. So the money was there. The governor was very clear about that commitment to teacher compensation. 2 to 4%. It's hard to say exactly how much teachers will receive individually because there is it goes those. You can use that for hiring new teachers. You can use that for support staff. It's not necessarily that every teacher is getting a 4% raise, but they are getting a significant bump, and it did become effective upon passing. So they didn't have to wait until the summer to get that additional increase. But yeah, I think that was just important to recognize the work. It's not nearly enough, but it's still moving us in the right direction in terms of raising that base pay over time.
Thank you. Quick follow-up. How are state leaders ensuring effective implementation of the programs that you're talking about, including making sure that they're reaching vulnerable students and that stakeholders are engaged in the work moving forward?
So that is the $1 million question. And I could spend the next 2 hours talking about our implementation efforts because everything, lives and dies with strong implementation, really. And so we're trying to make sure we've got pre and post test screeners for our summer camps. We're trying to make sure that all of our community partners are really engaged and understand the expectations, because this is not something that certainly the state board, our policy making arm of state government that I work with, can do. And even our Department of Education, who are close partners in the work and are traditionally the ones overseeing implementation, this is going to be monumental. So it's really trying to make sure that we have opportunities this spring to come together with our district leaders, with our charter school leaders, with our other state advocacy and support partners to kind of make sure everybody knows what their role and responsibility is. We need all hands on deck, and we need a clear plan for collecting data, reporting transparently on what's working. We hope many of these efforts will be successful, but we're not naive to believe that they all will be as effective as others. And so we need to know where our investments really should sustain over time. And certainly just in terms of attendance for students at these summer camps, we're seeing our districts and charter leaders do some creative things to think about how to incentivize students to get back into the classroom. So there's a number of NFL celebrities and others who are being tapped to just provide a little bit of fun and enthusiasm for this work, but trying to make it as easy as possible for parents to sign their children up, to ensure transportation, take away any of those barriers that might prevent particularly our most vulnerable students from attending.
Yeah, we've had more than a dozen questions come in from the participants today in our conversation. So probably want to circle back to implementation, but before we do, want to move on to some other panelists. We've been following the Connecticut State Department of Education's work, particularly around some of your promising approaches around tracking student attendance and engagement. Like everywhere across the country now, we've also been struggling with that. And I know, again, this is a a national challenge in keeping students engaged through the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about the strategies the department's been implementing around collecting and reporting learning and engagement data during the pandemic, and why is this new data that you're collecting, or was this spurred by the pandemic? What kind of data are you collecting, and why is that helpful to your efforts in keeping kids engaged and getting students re-engaged when they're back this fall?
Great, thank you, Amber, for the question and for the opportunity to participate in this panel discussion. So when obviously the pandemic hit in mid-March and schools closed across a lot of the country and in Connecticut, we all jumped into hyper action mode to support districts, whether it be through devices, connectivity, guidance. I mean, it was just nonstop, and it still is, hasn't let up. And so one of the things that became clear as the next school year, which is the current school year, started to come upon us was that not all schools were going to be open. Many were actually going to start remote, and many stayed remote for months, right? So part of the commitment from our state board was that, yes, remote school days will count towards the requirement in our state law for 180 school days if the Department of Education can track learner participation and learner attendance, and actually support school districts with not only dealing with the health issues around COVID, but also helping them to open school and offer in-person instruction to the fullest extent possible, safely, of course, but to the fullest extent possible. So then Commissioner Cardona, at that point, he and I, we talked about this extensively, and and after the board discussion, we wanted some kind of system that we could track not only sort of what models districts were using to open school with, whether they were in person, hybrid, or remote, but also at a student level, being able to know how attendance was and how students were attending, not just in person, but also on their remote days. So that was, and this was all new. This was all pandemic related, nothing prior to the pandemic. So we actually set up two collections. One is a weekly collection that collects the learning model offered by each district in every grade. And that's collected weekly, and that's been a game changer because the results from that data are used in a call that I'm missing now, actually, with our governor's office every Thursday, where we sort of look at which are the districts that are changing models, who is remote still, what kind of supports do we need. And so it would be senior leadership from the SDE, folks from the governor's office, and folks from public health. We'd all be talking, strategizing about how can we help that community deal with their health issues so that they can open and offer more in-person opportunities. Doesn't mean fully in-person, even hybrid, or maybe even for your most vulnerable students. So we would sort of take whatever we got in terms of being able to offer in-person instruction. So we had that learning model data, and that's how we've continued to use it. And just as of last week, almost 80% of our school districts are operating in a predominantly in-person, fully in-person learning model, which is pretty impressive. The second collection that we established was a student level attendance collection. And the attendance collection is basically asking for each student for the month, how did they attend? Basically days of membership, days of attendance, and split based on remote days, in-person days. Because we didn't necessarily want a label of a hybrid student. We wanted actual counts of how many days this month was this kid in person, how many days were they remote, and how did they attend in those two situations. That was remote attendance better than in-person attendance. So we set up that collection in September and started collecting data from October onwards about the student attendance, and have been reporting those data publicly, both on the learning model that the district is offering and on student attendance on a monthly basis. The learning model on a weekly basis. And we have partnered with Attendance Works extensively. The attendance data in particular is used in addition to publishing it on our website. It's used by our student supports offices. We release district level data. We've been releasing district level attendance rates and district level chronic absenteeism rates after a few months, because we don't want to release chronic absence too early because the denominator is too small to compute a percentage. But once we got 4 or 5 months of data, we started reporting chronic absence too, by district and also by student group. And so the child advocate in the state pays attention to that data, community stakeholders pay attention to that data, plus our own staff in working with districts. We run communities of practice. We partnered with attendance work extensively to provide supports to districts around student attendance and increasing participation and engagement in the classroom. And more recently, we're involved in a study with Attendance Works as well around the predictive power of early attendance for future attendance in a sort of mixed year like this. So I'll stop there and maybe if you have any follow-up questions, but those are the two big collections that we've set up, and that's kind of how we've used it.
How do you think that can be used come this fall to help with engagement in the next school year, kind of looking ahead, and how are you guys going to be leveraging that?
Not sure yet. You know, I actually fell off my chair when a district said, you know what, you should continue this next year. I said, what, is a district really asking for more data collection from the state after the pandemic? And you know, and they basically said, you know, it's actually helping us keep our data cleaner throughout the year. We usually only collected it once. So that's where it came from. So I'm not sure exactly what we're going to do next year. Just one other important point: in Connecticut, attendance is defined as the student being present for at least half the school day. So we actually extended that concept to remote days as well, and said that on a remote day, it's not just about logging in for one class. If they're signed up for 7 classes, they've got to be present in at least 4 of those classes. That's half the day, similar to what it would have been in person. Or the nature of the assignment should be meaty enough that it constitutes half a day. So we have that kind of definition. So even though we don't measure engagement sort of, you know, more deeply, it's just a attendance measure. It's a more sort of robust definition of attendance. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. Kevin, you were appointed by Governor Whitmer to lead the Student Recovery Advisory Council here in Michigan. Can you tell us about what the council has been tasked with and what have been some of the most challenging considerations for the group thus far? I know we know there are many, so we could spend the whole hour just talking about that, but if you could just highlight some of the toughest ones.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. It's an honor to be here. It is also a professional honor to be appointed by Governor Whitmer to lead our state's K-12 recovery efforts. Our council was tasked with providing guidance and recommendations for the more than 800 school districts in the state about creating those plans, because with each local district doing their own, there's tremendous amounts of inefficiency and redundancy at a time when school leaders have been frankly in crisis mode. And when we're asking about, you know, vision, they're asking about survival to get through this. And so we're tasked with looking at what's the evidence. So we looked at academic recovery. We looked at our, you know, student well-being, and part of that is our social emotional learning, mental health, but also the racialized trauma that our students have experienced. Physical health, we know that suffered through, you know, the pandemic. We also looked at family and community partnerships. If there's anything we've learned through the pandemic, is that we as a school system need to get closer to our parents and community organizations that also serve, you know, the 80% of time that kids don't spend in school, or for some students, the 100% of time that they haven't been in school. Post-secondary transitions, we know that the enrollment and FAFSA applications through the pandemic have gone down. So how can we make sure that we are paving the way for our students to have those post-secondary credential opportunities and not be held, you know, accountable for any, you know, unfinished learning, you know, through non-credit bearing college classes or credential programs. So we know, we look at our system has to adjust, not the kid. The kid's a victim of you know, this pandemic. We also looked at innovation and redesign. You know, what are some opportunities that are in front of us, because our system pivoted really on a moment's notice in ways that no one thought we really could. So now that we've demonstrated that we can because we had to, what can we do because we want to? How can we better align our practices with what the evidence from the learning sciences suggests? But also the policy implications to operationalize these plans. And so the recommendations are all either you know, evidence-based, evidence-informed, or best practices with data to support across that spectrum. And we know that it's likely that the recommendations are going to call for additional staffing. And so looking at what does the evidence suggest about the appropriate level of staffing, and tie that together with this strong infusion, I'll say generational infusion of federal funds to local schools, we have to make good on that promise that was invested in our schools through the value of stewardship and having the data and metrics to identify what is the need and to measure the impact of those funds so we can do so over a multi-year period of time. By the way, this is not going to happen by Labor Day, folks. This is going to take a multi-year period of time for our system to really adjust around the needs of our children so that we can pave that way for them to have success. And so I think there's a lot of things at play here. I think some core values of, equity, of trust, that we want to make sure that we create plans that our community understands and trusts, but also so we make good on the investment. So our council is really harnessed with all of those factors, and we did everything in about a 2-month period of time. We had over 80 people from across the state, experts across the spectrum, work on these recommendations. They'll be released here in the coming weeks, and I'm really proud of what the council's produced, and I can't wait to share it out.
That's great, Kevin. We're looking forward to digging into more details. I wonder, can you share a little bit about how equity is part of the recommendations and how you're ensuring the strategies that you're about to release are addressing historic and current inequities and systemic racism in our education system?
Yeah, so school climate is going to be a piece of the recommendations, and that's really focused on our racial equity goals. So equity audits and some tools and instruments so districts don't have to go find out what an equity audit is, so that they can conduct those efforts on their own or with support from either exemplar districts, which we'll provide, or also so from experts in the field. When we look at a recommendation, so I'll just stick back to that post-secondary example where we saw that enrollment and FAFSA completion was down. So a general recommendation would be to commit more energy and resources through maybe college navigators, through parent engagement for FAFSA, possibly, using, some tools and instruments like an app to connect better with our families. Through an equity lens, as we target those, traditionally under-resourced, underserved populations that, are exacerbated with the need, not just because of, the systemic inequities that exist, but also because we know that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted communities of color at greater rates. And so if we really want to target an equity-based recommendation, then we focus our energy on those specific areas that have data that suggests that the pandemic has hit them harder and that are traditionally under-resourced and underserved, which are communities of color and communities of poverty. So those are ways that we've tried to then say, look, what's a recommendation? And then what's an equity-based recommendation to make sure that, there's equity woven through all of the council's recommendations.
Thank you. Alana, under the leadership of Governor Polis, Colorado took an innovative approach to investing the governor's discretionary federal funds by issuing a set of competitive grants. Can you share more about this and why the governor decided to take that approach in particular?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me today. And I think some of the themes that we were thinking about in the establishment of the Response, Innovation, and Student Equity Program reflect much of the discussion that has already happened this morning. Well, morning for me, middle of the day for everybody else.
Yes.
Governor Polis has a very extensive background, both in education as a former state board member, State Board of Education member, and he served on the House Education Committee when he was in Congress. And he also has a thorough background in innovation and technology and business. And in many ways, our thinking fit that nexus. Colorado and our, based on the heroic efforts of our superintendents, our teachers, our students, our legislators, and the governor have been working to address the immediate concerns and the immediate pivot needs of the pandemic. But with the governor's emergency education relief funds, which are more discretionary and have fewer guardrails than many of the other stimulus funds that have come through to states, we wanted to shift our thinking a little bit. And the governor really wanted to pursue options that fostered innovation and collaboration in education, thinking a little more longer term and addressing the issues and challenges that we've seen for decades, but have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So we launched the Response, Innovation, and Student Equity Program, which we call RISE, to support high-needs school districts, charter schools, and institutions of higher education to create sustainable innovations to improve student learning, close equity gaps, and enhance operational efficiency for K through 12 through higher education. And it was an opportunity and a moment to build partnerships across philanthropy, across the private sector, and across education. We encouraged grant applicants to create collaboration and partnerships across school districts, across institutions, to share resources because challenges are often very similar. But we decided to launch a competitive grant program because, like Michigan, Colorado has a very diverse array of school districts. We have 178 school districts, many of which are urban and large, and the vast majority of which are rural and small, some with only 60 students. So while there are some universal challenges faced across the education landscape, there certainly are a diverse array of unique challenges that our smaller and rural school districts face that our large urban school districts do not, and vice versa. And so this was an opportunity for school districts, institutions of higher education, individual schools to come together to apply for grants that addressed unique challenges that they themselves were facing with a really innovative solution or proposed solution. Very, very often it's difficult to foster an opportunity to, can you still hear me?
Yes, you're back.
I'm sorry, I got a notification that my microphone changed. I apologize.
No, that's okay. We're used to it. It's Zoom life. Yes.
What I was saying was this was an opportunity to foster innovation in a way that often is difficult or challenging with federal grant programs in the public sphere. And we've since awarded over $40 million to 32 separate projects across our state. And those will be implemented over the coming 2 years, and we will have a number of lessons learned that we hope can be replicated and scaled statewide or used as examples nationally.
I think what you're talking about is really the way you guys have approached this is really interesting. And you just want to note that the comparison with Michigan in terms of the diversity of our communities and the students' needs, very true. One thing that, wonder if you could speak to the unique needs of rural students in particular, and how do you see that, how do you see their needs evolving in the next 2 years? We've noted here in Michigan, some of our analyses found that rural students in Michigan were the least likely to have internet and digital access right through the pandemic. But they're often, because the big, media outlets are not in rural areas, right? Those students are often not in the media spotlight, and they're often not at the center of, or even on the fringes of sort of the mainstream narrative. Can you talk about that and talk about how, what are some of the kinds of ways that you guys are going to be trying to both innovate and address equity at the same time through the RISE work?
I appreciate that. Colorado similarly has broadband challenges in our rural areas. And we are focusing on that critically outside of the RISE program at a very large scale. But as it relates specifically to RISE, I think the best way to explain some of the unique challenges and proposed solutions in our rural areas is to talk about some of the grants that were awarded specifically. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the RISE program encouraged applicants to partner across the region, across school districts, across institutions at different education levels, to foster this collaboration in an innovative approach. We had Hayden School District, which is a school district in northern Colorado with many rural areas, created a cross school district program with another neighboring school district to create a hands-on curriculum and community engagement around local food systems and agriculture and energy production and sustainability to help prepare students for careers in the Yampa Valley, to foster homegrown workforce and keep people who were grown in that, or who grew up in that area, in the local workforce, and to train them for the skills required for jobs and in that space. One of our public institutions partnered with 14 school districts in the San Luis Valley, which is a rural part of our state, as well as a partnership with the local Boys and Girls Club to share resources and prepare students with a higher economy of scale to be resilient and to train for rapidly changing industries and demand the local region's economic growth. And those are examples that I think have a similar theme, and there was a wide variety. But I think when compared to some of the RISE grants that were awarded in our urban areas, there clearly was this emphasis placed on sharing resources across districts in a way that doesn't often happen easily, and understanding that with the smaller rural school districts, there needs to be collaboration and sharing of resources as well.
Are there any urban or sort of metropolitan area RISE grants or strategies that you wanna highlight as well?
Yeah,
able to learn from.
I have many favorites, and again, we had over 30 awards, so I will not take all of your time going.
Yeah.
But some of my favorites were one of our local regional education organizations partnered with the Immigrant and Refugee Center of Northern Colorado, the University of Northern Colorado, and the Colorado State University. Again, these emphasis on partnerships to improve student and family outcomes for migrant families in the region. We had a charter school in the Denver area that primarily serves pregnant and parenting teens and their children in Aurora, which is a city right next to Denver. They received a grant to implement restorative practices and evidence-based strategies to help students repair relationships in schools and prevent disciplinary actions or anything exclusionary. So truly a diverse array of awards, which I think is unique to the discretionary nature of the funds that we're able to use for this.
Thank you so much. That's really, really great, and really just really inspiring to hear the diversity of the kinds of strategies and how they're also relevant to their local communities. I want to pivot to for a second coming back to data, and then we're gonna, in just a few minutes, we're gonna pivot to audience questions. As Michigan moves forward with its recovery plan around a lot of uncertainty about where we're, our surge levels have recently grown again, and it's been an uncertain time for schools and for parents. Wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Connecticut's data collection and how the reporting was intentionally gathering data on English language learners, students with disabilities, student race and ethnicity. Why was collecting and reporting that level of data about vulnerable students important to you guys and to the department in Connecticut? But also, what is the difference? What's the difference that kind of information can play in terms of supporting those students specifically?
Yeah, thank you. When you collect data at the student level, obviously it enables you to disaggregate the data 9 ways to Sunday. And so when with the pandemic, it was obvious, I think many of the speakers have referenced that the disproportionate impact of this is often felt by those most in need. And school is a leveler in many ways, not necessarily just shown by test scores, but just by being there and providing the services that they do. Schools are a leveler. And so we were committed from day one to disaggregate the attendance data into these different student groups. And we knew very early on in the pandemic that our English learners and students with disabilities, or English learners particularly, actually, not our students with disability, more so our English learners, were disproportionately more fully remote than other families. So, yes, that sort of interplayed with race as well, but that led our English language EL consultant to work with parent support groups and really put out sessions, webinars in multiple languages, speaking to families about how it's safe to send your kids to school and why it's important for kids to be in school to learn. And so having the granular data, it also gives credibility. Otherwise it looks like you're hiding something. So I think from the very beginning, we were sort of like, if we're going to collect this attendance data, it's going to be at the student level so that we can do all kinds of analyses. We also learned about homeless student population. It's a small population, but is still continuing to struggle with student attendance. So that brings in the homeless consultant and that support community to assist with helping districts with strategies that may be necessary.
Thank you. I think the English language learners have also really been disproportionately hit here based on what we know anecdotally in communities and the little data that we do have about that. So, and it's really concerning. The national data that's, as you all know, that's been released has been highlighting the needs of that community as well. And I want to, on that note, I want to apologize for not saying your name right. So I speak Spanish as well, and I've been pronouncing it with a Spanish pronunciation. I've been saying it Ajit, and so I've been corrected. It's Ajit. Is that right? I apologize.
Yes.
So yes. So
It's
I'm
quite
Hispanic
all right.
and I speak Spanish, and I was reading it in my Spanish head. I had my Spanish language going on when I was reading that. So
And I know you were talking to me, so we're good.
Good. Okay. Thank you. We have a lot of questions about from our participants today on what the what do we need to be prioritizing for return to school in the fall. Sarah, I wonder if you could start with that. What do we need to be prioritizing for the fall, and what can we be doing as a society? What can parents, what can educators, what districts are doing to get ready for the fall, to get ready for the new school year? As others said, after maybe a little bit of a break, because I do think the fatigue is real. Many of my teacher friends are really, really tired out. It's been a tough year, and parents are tired too. So how do you guys manage that? How do we think about energizing people again, if especially including for summer instruction and using the most of the summer for unfinished learning?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll speak to what we're prioritizing in Tennessee, recognizing that, again, as you said, your rates are surging in Michigan. Situations are different from state to state. So I'll let you know kind of how we're thinking about that question. Namely, I think we have to be all hands on deck, as I mentioned before, about maximizing every opportunity with students to both recover lost learning and accelerate. And so that means, I think, really intentional planning for the summer, thinking about the schedule such that you give your teachers a break. You're also thinking about compensating them for that additional work. I think that's really key. We can ask educators to come back uncompensated to do that additional work. And then going into the school year, I think a couple things instructionally, we don't want to necessarily go back and reteach all the things that students potentially have lost. So once we have a good baseline of data, we need to be working with our educators to understand how they start at grade level, for next year, while also making sure they're doing real time, catch up instruction on key concepts without reteaching everything that was lost. I think that's going to be a delicate balance to reach in some cases in terms of making sure that we're meeting students at grade level with rigorous content, even knowing that some of those key concepts may need to be revisited.
One of the questions that we got is about what you said. And Anna says, how can we ensure all students are supported to learn and achieve to their capacity without overwhelming teachers with differentiation for subjects at a 5 to 6 year span of mastery levels in any given subject? But even if we don't think 5 to 6 years out, even the next 2 years, And how do you guys, can you, as in terms of, can state leaders support that? How can, is that the role of the state? How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I've been with the state long enough now to be very mindful of what the state can do well and what we have no business doing. And we are not the ones in classrooms working with students. We need to set up opportunities and systems for districts to have great success with students and honor that work. And so I think it's about ensuring through our policy and sort of funding that districts have what they need to do this work well, and that they're not doing it alone. I mentioned before the high dosage tutoring, the after school, mini camps that we're going to be running. I think those are excellent opportunities for our partners to lean in. We've got a number of great nonprofit organizations, other sort of non-governmental groups that are in many cases better situated to help serve the non-academic needs, to do some of those tutoring. We're also, thinking as creatively as possible about everyone who could, potentially be part of our cadre of leaders helping to serve our students, starting with our ed prep candidates. That's a great opportunity for them to get some experience tutoring students and working in schools and classrooms while they're still finishing their certification and degrees. So I think it really is about looking at philanthropy, looking at non-governmental organizations, thinking about those after school and tutoring opportunities as a way to supplement and support what our classroom teachers are doing to, bridge the gap and move students forward, as fast as possible in terms of making up the lost ground.
Thank you. Okay, lots of questions coming in. Here's jump in, anybody. If otherwise, I'll have to call on you and put my teacher hat on and call on somebody. How do you bring leading state and solution-oriented solutions to the local level? And so I think, again, this is, again, we've had lots of questions about implementation, challenge for everybody, no matter what state we're in. Alana and Kevin, do you guys want to take a stab at that?
Sure, absolutely. So, the question about how do you bring these high leverage, solutions and operationalize them at local school districts? Yeah, I think that's where the rubber hits the road with any guidance, that one, is it intuitive so people can understand what it is you're trying to do? I think secondly is, can you provide some tangible examples? All these evidence-based or evidence-informed practices came from somewhere. They came from, so high dosage tutoring is one that's gotten a lot of attention because of the study that supports that practice. Well, it was tried out, in a school district. And so we have some evidence of where that works. I think also how we provide technical assistance through our membership associations, in partnership with philanthropy, through in Michigan, our education service agencies are called intermediate school districts. How can we leverage those economies of scale supports so educational leaders aren't doing this alone? And how can we provide the tools for stakeholder engagement so that the implementation can actually reflect what the needs of the community? Because in Michigan, we've had students that have been in person all year. We've had students that have been remote all year, and everything in between. So a one size fits all approach for how this operationalizes won't work. And, and I'm proud in this district, we've offered, full in person since day one for those families that wanted it. And, so for our data shows that those students who have been in person full year have achieved at higher levels than our students have chosen remote all year. So our strategy and approach can't be universal, even within a small district that I lead. We have to have many tools in our belt, and we also have to engage our partners. We can't do this alone. And again, schools have kids for 20% of the time. What about that other 80? Well, of course, learning occurs. So how can we engage our families, our community members, those grassroots organizations? Summer camps are great opportunities to really look at a holistic approach about how we support whole child recovery.
Yeah. On that note, I'm sorry, go ahead. Alana, please go ahead.
I certainly want to echo everything Kevin just said. I think that those are universal concerns or considerations across our country. In Colorado, we are a local control state, and we certainly respect the autonomy of our school districts, and it adds a level of complexity to statewide solutions, certainly. So similarly with providing technical assistance and guidance, But I also think that's one of the reasons that we pursued competitive grants as specifically part of this RISE program, knowing that that's not always the right solution, and it doesn't work for everything. But in this case, it enabled local districts to be able to tell us what the issues were and what their solutions that they perceived to be innovative ways to address those challenges was a much better approach than us telling them from the state level what a solution would be or would look like, given all of the complexities and nuances of each individual district and the challenges that they face.
Mhm.
I think another piece that I would add is the importance of ensuring that we truly evaluate and do a comprehensive lessons learned of this moment, so that as we move forward, knowing that many of the challenges that we are facing are not new, but they've certainly been exacerbated by the pandemic, and looking at all of the immense amount of innovation and the pivots that have taken place and what has worked and what hasn't, so that we can use that in the policymaking world to our advantage as we think about the challenges that persist after this current moment.
So we have 4 more questions. I don't know that we're going to be able to address all of them, but let's try to tackle a couple. Great question from Kimberly and Flint. Talking about, thank you, Alana. Talking about strategies that have been particularly successful in supporting socio-emotional health and success. And again, I love it if not to talk about what's been done, but really looking forward. What are you imagining when you think about the next 2 school years, really, and we think about the recovery from what for many students has been a very traumatic experience. And we know, again, based on national research, child abuse being up, other kinds of traumatic experiences being up through the pandemic. What are some goals and strategies that can be leveraged both in terms of the local level in the next 2 school years, and also the state's role in those kinds of strategies? And I mean, money is almost always the problem. Money's now not the problem. So how are you guys thinking about, please, anybody would like to jump in on that question, and for the next school year and the following school year? Sarah, you have your mute off first, so I'll call in.
I'll offer a couple of quick thoughts. I was with the head of our Tennessee Organization of School Superintendents the other day, and this has been sort of their problem of practice this last year with a network of other states. And I'm not sure the specifics of what they're planning to do, but they've got a number of things that they're working through in terms of supporting educators, because their belief is that we've got to support the mental health and emotional health of our educators so that they can kind of have their oxygen masks on as they go to serve our students. So I thought that was really smart and important. And then from the state level, the other thing that our Department of Education is working to do is to offer all of our districts and schools the opportunity to have their schools become trauma-informed schools, which is just a designation that they would receive after going through some additional training and getting some supports to ensure, in some cases, it's just a refresher. You've got schools and educators who are really well steeped in what it takes to meet students who are dealing with trauma and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. But in other cases, you've got educator communities who are not used to dealing with that kind of challenge in the student populations that they serve. So just, one way that we're trying to make sure both educators and students are going to be able to get the services they need. I do think this is going to be a great area of challenge and something that we're going to have to continue to look at as a state and retool as we see what additional supports are needed, because we definitely don't have the number of counselors and psychologists in most of our school buildings that we ultimately need. It's another place where I think partner organizations can really lean in, and we've got some good groups through Communities and Schools and other support organizations like that who are going to be really invaluable to us, I think, going into next school year.
Do you think that because of the stimulus dollars that there will be sort of restaffing for counselors, for example?
I think
because of the short stint of the dollars, are people not going to move toward like a permanent human capital solution? Or yeah.
I think the latter. I think it's, again, with short-term dollars, it's going to be hard to bring people on in a full-time capacity. I think there will be contracts and sort of additional sort of short-term supports that potentially are sort of full-time counselors, but in a similar vein, kind of trying to provide those same services. And then at the state level, we have an obligation to continue to fund at a lower ratio, the number of counselors and psychologists. And we have made some progress on that in recent years through the basic education program funding, but there's more to do there for sure.
Ajit, you had your mute off as well. Would you like to jump in here?
Sure, real briefly, I think ask students how they're doing, listen to them, and then do something about what they're saying. I think that's like key in this. And we've heard that from districts who continued doing these types of checks with their students throughout the year. At the state level, we did this company, I won't mention their name, but it's like a crowdsourcing thoughts platform where students can just go type in their thoughts and then they rate each other's thoughts, and set of thoughts bubble up to the top, if you will, based on their rating. So we conducted 2 of those, one in the spring of last year, sort of in the middle of the first wave, and then again in December. And we're planning another one actually next month to say what are lessons from the pandemic that we should take and not forget about and implement next year. And I think when you talk to students, some of the things you hear are that they actually, when we went remote, they prefer synchronous instruction, or at least some synchronous instruction. They don't want it to be completely asynchronous. Don't give me the assignment, make me learn it myself and figure it out myself. Teach me. It's kind of what they're saying, or at least that was a consistent theme. And also that recognizing that when things go online, it is not the same as just taking the on-ground class and putting it online, that it means something different. It's a very different experience for the student. I think student feedback is key, and then doing something about it is key. The one thing we're doing at the state level is we have procured a strengths-based assessment, actually an SEL screener, that we're making available to all districts at no cost. It's not a mandate, but we're making available to all districts at no cost. And we're gonna sort of run it like another state assessment, but it's optional. Districts don't have to do it if they don't want to, but if they do, then there will be lots of value add for them. So we're launching that whole new initiative next year.
Thank you. Thank you for simplifying what can be for systems thinkers, something as simple as ask some child what they need. So thank you for reminding us of that something as simple as that exchange can be really powerful. On that note, I just want to lift up Phoenix Union High School. The example that you're giving is doing just that, set up a system so that every student in the district is reached once a week to have that kind of a conversation so that they can respond more in real time to those socio-emotional needs. We have just a few more minutes. I want to try to squeeze in one more question for maybe 1 or 2 panelists. Last question. Digital divide. We know that that's been just a huge challenge, especially in urban and rural communities and many working class communities and even middle class communities in our state. Kevin, can you tell us a little bit about ways that federal dollars and the role of policy in both at the state and the local level in bridging the digital divide over the next 2 years?
I think there's a couple of pieces of this. One is the hardware, getting the devices into our kids' hands. And at no point in our history has there been, the amount of value that we can get out of it. We talk about a Chromebook for $185, that operates, we can't imagine what that is. And so it's made it more approachable for districts. And then secondly is, can we make internet access a public good? Because when you look at our biggest gaps, I would argue it's actually in our rural areas, where a hotspot doesn't help them because they don't have cell phone service either,
Right.
And so when you're looking at that digital divide and I lead a very urban district of high poverty, so 95%, free reduced lunch, and 93% of our families said they have internet that a computer can connect to. And that's taking advantage of some programs, that have, if you meet eligibility, a lower rate, like $10 a month. So then as a school district, it makes it quite easy then to just fill that gap. And we actually created partnership with the broadband providers where they directly bill us so we can assist, with internet, or we provide hotspots as necessary. But can we use E-rate through federal funds to really expand internet throughout our states, and especially those areas that have the least bit of connection? There's a tremendous amount of economies of scale that can be happen through that type of collaboration. In Michigan, the MISON network can get local school districts internet, at 20 cents on the dollar. So how can school districts in those gaps fill that community need for internet access? And how can we use E-rate funds, which is a great lever for equity, to provide internet as a public good throughout our country?
Well said. Thank you. And we're looking forward to seeing the recommendations that the council will be sharing in the next few weeks. We're at 12:59. I promised everyone that we would only use up their lunch hour today. So I want to extend a sincere thanks to all of you, not only for taking your time today, but also for your public service, and for not just during what has been an extraordinary year, but what I know for many of you is years and even decades. So many, many thanks. And on behalf of Kevin in particular, on behalf of kids around the state, thank you for all of the hard work. I know it's been a really challenging year, and I can only imagine how grueling it's been for you and your teams through this year. Thank you for everybody for taking time during their lunch hour today. We really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your great questions before and during the conversation. If you're interested in learning more about how to get involved and how to be an equity advocate in our state, please come to our website, www.attrustmidwest.org, and sign up for updates and other ways to get more involved. In the coming months, we'll be doing more webinars on relevant and time-sensitive topics through the pandemic. So wishing all of you safety and good health as we continue to navigate this crisis together. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Sure, thank you.